Karoline Leavitt and the liberal judge clash in a battle of ideals, truths that cut like glass through the hollowness of power. Want the inside story? Subscribe now, this is the moment you don't want to miss. The room hums with quiet energy, a dimly lit TV studio where the cold fluorescence of cameras flickers like a dying flame against the plain interior. Leather chairs, cracked with age, sit rigid in the off-white space, their edges worn from years of battles between those who speak and those who listen. The air is taut, charged with the kind of tension that doesn't crackle with excitement, but with the kind of intensity that makes people forget to blink. The marble lectern at the center of the stage stands like a monument to confrontation, its surface polished to a dull sheen by the footprints of those who have stood there before. The silence before the first words is louder than any shouting, a hush that swells with anticipation. At the head of the room, Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, posed with the confidence of someone who's spent years shaping narratives, her fingers curled around the edge of the lectern like a predator preparing to strike. Across from her, the liberal judge sits unmoving, his presence a steady anchor in a sea of chaos. His expression is unreadable, and the way his eyes rest on her is like a scalpel slicing through her armor. The stakes are clear as if etched in the walls. One side defends the government's story, the other dismantles it with every syllable. The cameras don't blink, but they might as well be part of the audience, watching as this conflict unfolds like a slow-burning fire, the kind that threatens to consume everything in its path. Karoline Leavitt stood with the practiced grace of someone who had spent her career standing where she was now. Her left hand brushed against the creased leather of the chair as she adjusted herself, a small but deliberate act of control. The room smelled of stale air and something sharper, detective work perhaps. She wasn't just here for the show, every word would ripple through the world, every pause a calculated risk. Her reputation as the White House's most formidable voice had been built on a foundation of polished rhetoric and unwavering appeal to the public's trust. But she knew this was different. The liberal judge hadn't just crossed her path. He had planted a seed of doubt, one that now threatened to bloom into a thicket she couldn't clear. She adjusted her posture again, straightening her back like a soldier preparing for a siege. The judge sat without a single twitch, but his stillness was deceptive. It wasn't the calm of a disinterested onlooker, it was the calm of a strategist, someone who had studied her every misstep, every misfired quip. He knew that her confidence was her armor, but also her vulnerability. Karoline had spent a lifetime in the spotlight, but here, in this room, she was no longer the one asking the questions. He watched her like an old pelican observing a shoal of fish, waiting for the right moment to strike. The tension between them was the kind that builds not from sound, but from the air itself, thick and electric, as if the walls might crack under the weight of what was about to come. At her core, she believed she held the high ground, but for the first time in a long while, the ground felt unsteady beneath her feet. The judge rarely spoke first. He let others do the work of building the house, then planned the demolition. But today, the audience could feel his presence like a shadow pressing against Karoline's every move. He wasn't just reacting to her arguments, he was analyzing them as if dissecting a battlefield strategy. His eyes never left hers. He didn't need to. Karoline took a breath, deep and deliberate. She had prepared for this, for everything. Her voice was practiced, polished to a shine, but it carried the weight of something greater. It was the kind of voice that could stop a heartbeat, a blade that could cut through the dust of political obfuscation. She had spent years building it, refining it like a sharpshooter adjusting the trigger on his rifle. This was where the truths would cut like glass, where ideals would clash with the hardcore of facts, and she was ready to let the world see who would stand and who would fall. The judge didn't need a voice like hers to be loud. He had people who believed in what he said and institutions that would back him if he ever needed it. But Karoline was dangerous because she didn't just speak, she shaped the narrative. This was more than a debate. It was war, and the weapons were language, legacy, and the fragile line between belief and evidence. The room held its breath. Karoline's next words would be her opening gambit. She had seen strategies fail, compromises crumble, and credibility erode like sand from the hands of a child. Today, she would not let that happen. She stepped forward, the weight of truth pressing against her confidence like a storm. Her voice was steady, but beneath it was the kind of fire that could burn through steel. Let the battle begin. Karoline Leavitt scowled, her fingers fanning out like the petals of a closed flower ready to bloom. She had long believed in her own armor, certainty, and conviction. Her carefully cultivated response to the judge's challenge had been years in the making. A story woven from fragments of her own experience, a narrative that would make audiences feel the sting of injustice before they even understood the facts. Today, she would not wait for the judge to strike. She would remind the audience that she had fought for her voice to be heard, a voice that had once been drowned out by the chaos of misinformation. She had seen it before, the way the public listens, the way the truth is shaped by the messenger. She had walked the halls of the White House, where confidence was currency, and she had spent her career turning uncertainty into unity. But this wasn't the same. The judge's silence was not a weakness, it was a prelude. He would not be swayed by sentiment alone. Still, she knew the power of the right heart-wrenching story, of the right image the audience could carry with them after the lights dimmed and the cameras rolled. She had prepared her anecdotes carefully, each one a scalpel, each one a wound to be reopened. The tension thickened like a fog closing in from the edges of a battlefield. Karoline's posture was impeccable, her gaze unwavering, but beneath that she felt the spark of doubt flicker. The judge had always been methodical, a man who dissected arguments with the precision of a surgeon. He would not be impressed by stories alone. Still, she pressed on, her voice a thread of determination weaving through the fabric of the room. She had been raised to believe in the power of truth, but she knew truth was a currency that could be manipulated, twisted to suit the agendas of those in power. The judge, she suspected, was not a man who would accept that version of truth. Then, from the corner of the room, a low hum began. The cameras flickered, their mounted eyes adjusting, ready to capture the fire that was about to erupt. Karoline straightened her shoulders, the first line of her opening ready to be unleashed. She had spent her life counting the number of times she had stood in a room like this, the number of times she had believed she had the upper hand. But today she didn't feel it. She didn't feel it at all. Karoline's voice dropped, each word weighted like a stone dropped into water. I was 22, she said, her tone soft but steady, standing in the lobby of the Lincoln Memorial holding a press pass I had fought for like a lifeline. The fog that rolled in that morning was heavier than any I had ever known. I had come to report on a protest that was supposed to be about civil rights, but it turned into a reckoning. A man collapsed in the middle of the street, his leg torn to shreds by a vehicle that had been caught on camera. I remember the way he looked at me, like a ghost from a past I had only heard about once before. Her fist curled slightly, as if gripping the man's hand. The audience leaned in, drawn by the hush that had fallen over them. Karoline had spent her life in the spotlight, but the memory of that day still made her heart ache. She had written the story, polished the facts, shaped the narrative to fit the public image that would protect her legacy. But in that instant, standing beside the man who was bleeding into the pavement, she had realized the limits of her words. They could capture the moment, they could tell the story, but they could not fill the silence that followed the sonorous crash of the emergency sirens. Her voice rose again, cutting through the hush like a blade. That was when I understood that truth was not just something that could be told, it was something that had to be felt. It was when I decided I would never let the public feel helpless again, not when I could speak for them. The cameras blinked like startled birds, their lenses adjusting to the force of her words. The air in the room had shifted, the storm pressing harder now, but Karoline didn't stop. She had come to make the judge remember that emotion was not noise, it was fire. The liberal judge listened without blinking, his fingers steepled in front of him, a calm that belied the storm raging before him. He was not without compassion, but he had long since learned that facts were the only true armor in a fight like this. That was a terrible day, he said after a beat, his voice measured, like a man who had dissected the weight of every word before speaking them. But Karoline, your story is no different from the hundreds of others that have been told in the past decade. In an analysis of 18 months of FOIA requests, my team found that over 70% of the disappearing press passes were attributable to clerical errors or misdirected protocol. The last time I checked, the Lincoln Memorial doesn't have its own DMV. His words were precise, hitting like a well-aimed arrow. Karoline had prepared for rebuttals, but not for this kind of dissection. The room had shifted again, the storm now a hurricane, and the judge had known exactly where to strike. I've seen those numbers, she replied, her voice a whisper now. I've seen the reports, the line graphs, the hollow reassurances. But what does that mean to the man who collapsed on the street? What does it mean to the families who are told their bodies are missing because of an error in the system? The judge tilted his head slightly, the way a chess player might when considering a new move. It means the system has problems, he said, his tone cool but not dismissive. But it also means the system wants to be fixed. I've spent my career ensuring that happens. My clients, people like you, come to me because they believe the system can be made better even when it fails. Her jaw tightened. She had spent her life in Washington, where the system was often meant to be fixed, not to improve. The judge wasn't wrong, but the idea that the system could be made better for someone like her, someone who had clawed their way to the top, was both comforting and maddening. I didn't get to be where I am by trusting the system, she said, her voice now a low rumble beneath the surface. I built my own path, the judge chuckled, but it was not a sound of condescension. It was the sound of a man who had already seen too much of the world that Karoline had built. And the system has spent years trying to build its own path to you. The air between them was thick with the kind of tension that could break a limb. Karoline's confidence had been dented, but she had spent her life resisting every dent, and she would not do so now. The liberal judge leaned back slightly, his fingers unclenching from the steeple unconsciously, a gesture of calculation. "You're here for reasons that don't just boil down to emotion," he said, his tone cutting through the room like a acute blade. "You're here because the American public needs clarity, and there's no avoiding the numbers that show society has reached a breaking point." He didn't pause to let the words settle, just as he had trained himself not to. Karoline's heart had already turned to stone, but the judge didn't stop. He continued, his voice measured but firm, the kind of authority that made people sit up and listen. "The violence is up. The number of reported incidents in the last 3 years has increased by 42% compared to a decade ago. These aren't just statistics, they're the screaming individuals caught in the crosshairs of a system that either lacks the will or the capacity to respond." Karoline's expression remained unreadable, but the way her fingers twitched at the edge of the lectern betrayed her. She had spent years in the White House shaping narratives, but the judge was unearthing facts she had spent her career avoiding. His tone was that of someone who had seen too many first-hand accounts, had read too many court transcripts that pulsed with the agony of lives lost to confusion, negligence, or a lack of resources. She finally spoke, her voice calm but laced with something dangerous. "Those numbers are skewed," she said. "They count incidents of violence, but they don't count the lives that were saved because of policies we've implemented. They don't count the communities that have been revitalized by our actions." The judge tilted his head, an almost imperceptible movement that conveyed his disappointment more than his anger. "You ignore that the New York Times documented over 200 cases this year alone, where families of missing persons were not properly notified under the current protocols. That doesn't just skew numbers, it erases people." Karoline's eyes darkened, but she held her ground. "And you don't think people were erased before we were even in office?" The judge's gaze never wavered. "If you mean the 100,000 missing without cause over the past 30 years, I assume you're not in denial about that either." The room was holding its breath now. Karoline's voice rose again, the storm pressing harder now. "Those numbers sound like a crisis, but it's not all about the government, it's about the people who don't know where to turn." The judge nodded slightly, as if testing the truth of her words. "Yes," he said. "But the people who don't know where to turn are exactly the ones we must force to look up." Karoline clenched her jaw. She had spent years believing her words, her narratives, could bridge the gap between truth and trust. But today, the judge had forced her to reconsider, and she had just one more chance to prove she could still shape the story. Karoline's voice surged forward, like a tide reclaiming the shore. She leaned in slightly, the expression on her face suddenly a mix of ferocity and something more fragile. "You think the system can fix everything?" Her words were sharp now, as if she had spent years honing them into a blade. "You think you can reduce the complexity of real people to a few rows of data, a press release, or a statistic? That's not truth, Judge, that's barely a rumor." She had long since learned the power of this kind of accusation. It worked like a tourniquet, slowing the bleeding of reason, shifting the focus from facts to her ability to make the judge feel guilty for something he had not yet done. The judge didn't react, but she could see the flicker in his eyes, an almost imperceptible blade pushing back. He countered immediately, his voice as calm as ever but now hardened with something that sounded like a cure for her illness. "I think the system can fix what it wants to fix," he said, the words like a machine rebuilding itself. "I spent my early career as a public defender, and in that time I saw the cost of not fixing things. You remember what the system costs people, don't you? You were the one who said it would fix everything." Karoline's eyes narrowed, but she didn't blink. "Because trust is the foundation of everything I do," she said, her voice now a whisper. "And you would have replaced trust with a ledger. You can't be both a custodian of the public imagination and a critic of its needs," the judge said, his voice quieter now, the kind of quiet that could cut deeper than anger. "You've spent your life relying on the trust of others, expecting it to be yours for the taking. What happens when that trust is gone?" Karoline's jaw tightened again, but she had no immediate response. The judge had done it again, hit her where she had least expected, where emotion was most fragile. She had spent years convincing the public that trust was more important than the system's flaws. She would not let that belief unravel now, not when it had taken her a lifetime to build. Her words cut through the room like a blade, fast and precise. "You think I've never tasted betrayal," she said, her jaw cooling in an almost uncontrolled way. "I was at the Lincoln Memorial that day, standing beside a man who had been turned away from medical care he needed because of red tape, because of somewhere someone thought it could be buried like bad news in the archives of a truly broken system." Her heartbeat was a metronome now, steady but dangerously close to betraying her. The judge had done it again, hit her where she had least expected, where emotion was most fragile. She had spent years convincing the public that trust was more important than the system's flaws. She would not let that belief unravel now, not when it had taken her a lifetime to build. Her voice surged once more, but now it was edged with something else, something like fear. You're asking me to believe that the system is broken because it doesn't move fast enough for someone like you, someone who spent a lifetime seeing through the cracks. The judge tilted his head slightly, like a man who thought he had just uncovered the flaw in her logic. And yet, Karoline, he said, his voice steady, you never seem to lift a finger to pull the system forward. You've spent your time guaranteeing that the public gets the version of the truth that suits you. What happens when the people decide they want something else? Karoline's breath caught for the first time, but the audience didn't notice. The cameras had already moved forward, focusing on the fire in her eyes. You're not asking the question, Judge, she said, her voice now a controlled rage. You're trying to convince me that the truth I've always believed in is something else. He didn't smile, he didn't laugh. It is something else. It's not what you think it is. The room was holding its breath again. Karoline's defiance was a fire now, one that could not be extinguished, but for the first time she was not the only one kindling it. The liberal judge watched as Karoline's fire flared once more, her gaze sharp, her voice a blade slicing through the air. But he had spent his life knowing that fire could be redirected, toward destruction or toward clarity. He leaned forward slightly, his voice even now but the weight behind it unmistakable. What if I told you that the data I used to make my case were collected by the Department of Justice, and every single one of them was based on the premise that people like you, people in power, have the right to shape the truth before the people can see it? Karoline's eyes narrowed, but she didn't pull back. That's not how it works. Only the people in power make the decisions that reshape the world. He raised an eyebrow, but his voice remained calm. You think you're the only one who can. Karoline's confidence faltered for the first time that evening, just for a second, long enough for the judge to notice. He had trained himself to read the slightest hesitation, the smallest crack in someone's armor. She stepped back slightly, but it was not a retreat. It was the moment before a strike. You think I've never seen what the system can do when it chooses to act, she said, her voice lower now, like a blade she could not yet unsheathe. You think I've never seen the damage of a single decision made by someone who had no skin in the game? The judge's expression didn't change, but he had already prepared for this. So what's different now, Karoline? What have you done to ensure the system acts in the way you want it to? Her silence was louder than any answer could be. The judge's hand moved slightly, as if weighing the case. You've spent your life as a leader, but power without action is just an illusion. Karoline's voice surged once more, but now it was edged with something else, something like fear. And without trust, power is nothing. She had said it before, but today she was beginning to question whether she could afford to believe it. And the judge had only just begun to diagram the case he had begun to lay out. The room was electric now, the kind of tension that came from the clash of two titans, one who had shaped the government's voice, the other who had dissected its flaws. The audience could feel it, the way the air itself was thick with the weight of what was coming. Karoline's voice dropped once more, this time like a nightfall in a world that had forgotten the concept of darkness. You think I'm looking to protect the system, she said slowly. But I've seen too many systems fail when it hands down decisions to people who don't have the power to make them right. The judge, still watching her, moved his fingers slightly, like a man with a pen preparing to record the next move in an argument he had already won. You've never wanted to be right, Karoline. You've always wanted people to believe you were right. Her mouth curved into a thin line, but she knew she had already lost steps in this battle. Karoline Leavitt's voice was like the moon's surface, cold and unyielding. You talk about the people, the families of the missing, the lives that have been affected. But what about the people who are trying to keep this country from collapsing under the weight of its own failures? You think I've spent a lifetime shaping the public's mind for my own gain? The judge's eyes remained fixed on hers, but he had already turned the page in the argument. He tilted his head slightly, as if thinking of how best to dismantle the next leg of her defense. Why would you think that? He said, his voice like the weight of a stone being dropped into water. You were elected because people believed in your voice. You were trusted not because you shaped what they believed, but because what you said was something they had already felt. Karoline's jaw tightened again, and this time the judge didn't look away. He had seen the way people like her could manipulate politics, but he had also seen the way they could be broken. I wouldn't be here, she said, her voice sharp again, if people didn't believe in something bigger than their own pain. They believe in a government that can fix what's broken. That's why I'm here. The judge studied her for a moment, then spoke with the kind of certainty that only came from years of courtroom silences and unspoken conclusions. And I'm here because I see what happens to people when that government doesn't. Karoline's expression didn't change, but the room had shifted again. She had not broken, not yet, but the judge had planted the seed of doubt, and even the thickest soil could not escape the pressure of a year in the making. She stood one step from the edge of the fight, her voice rising once more. Then we'll see whose story fractures first, Judge. The judge smiled faintly, but there was no triumph in it. I've seen that happen before, Karoline. I hope you're ready to see it again. And then the air in the room thickened once more, as if the two of them had just begun to build the first defenses against what was to come.